You can all hear me. That's great. First of all, it's great to be here, and thank you all for coming. I know you had to, trek through some brutal weather out there today. Yeah, actually, I arrange, when I do these community speaking engagements, I only do it if it's nice out. No, of course, I'm kidding. But it is nice to have such a beautiful day, quite a stretch of weather, which means when eventually it flips, it may be a little bit harder for us to adjust to because we're getting used to this kind of fantasy that's going on out there. But this may actually turn out to have some record-breaking warm days in it before this warm spell is through. But anyway, you're looking at a very fortunate person because I had a passion, meteorology, and I had a great opportunity to express that through a very long and fortunate career in a great part of the country to live and work. So I'm very appreciative of that, very much so. And just before we're going to talk about, obviously, our climate, just want to tell you just a little bit, just very briefly, about how I actually got to this point. Yes, I've had a long, wonderful career in Boston, 25 years at Channel 7 before coming over to Channel 5, which was a real treat because the first 6.5 years that I was at Channel 5, I had the pleasure of teaming up with Dick Albert, who you all know, remember, and love. And I think that's the only time in our industry something like that ever happened. And what I mean by that is that both Dick and I, at the time we joined forces, had been chief meteorologists at competing stations for a quarter of a century and then teamed up. And that has never happened before. And you might wonder, well, yeah, that does seem a little bit weird because, you're competing against each other for so long. But even though we did, we actually became not only colleagues, but good friends. We had a lot in common. We both loved weather. We both were into it since we were kids. We found out we both loved tennis, and we would get a chance to play tennis because we both had late hours, working from the early afternoon till late at night. So sometimes during the week, in mornings, late mornings, we'd get out on the tennis court. And we also got to attend, usually every year, there is a conference somewhere in the United States. It's a broadcast meteorology conference. It's sponsored by the American Meteorological Society, which is our professional organization as meteorologists. And there was a time earlier in our careers where you were allowed to bring your spouse to these conventions. And so Dick would bring his wife, I would bring mine. We'd have a chance to go out to dinner. Our wives got along very well. And so it was very natural to have this friendship. So when the opportunity presented itself for me to go over to Channel 5 and join Dick, and each of us would be co-chief meteorologist, thinking it through, it seemed like a great thing. And so it was wonderful. And then Dick retired 6 or 7 years later. Very unfortunately, Dick passed away about 5 years ago, which obviously is very tough, first and foremost, for his family, of course, for all New Englanders, everybody who knew him. And he was not only a good friend and a colleague, pretty close to like a brother. So that was obviously tough for me personally as well. But it was great to know him and the chances we had to work together. And once Dick retired, then I was the chief meteorologist at Channel 5 until I retired this past spring. But the nice thing is there's kind of an ongoing relationship. This is all the station's idea, which was very nice. So they've given me this title of Chief Meteorologist Emeritus, okay? Which, to me is like, well, that's like for prestigious professors or things like that. But it's very nice. And so I still am involved a little bit, as you heard, speaking, to community groups, which I like. I enjoy that. And there are a couple of things I'll still be doing at the station. I hope to get together next week with Dr. Judah Cohen, who's a seasonal forecasting expert. He's a PhD in meteorology. His full-time work is at a company called Atmospheric and Environmental Research in Lexington, Mass. But he has definitely been doing research on some additional factors that could affect how our winter goes, one of them being, believe it or not, the snow cover in Siberia during the month of October may be a hint as to what our winters will be like. Of course, there are many other factors, many variables. That's a pretty hard thing to do. The proof of how difficult that is was back in December of 1989. So we're going back, what, like 33 years? That was the coldest December on record. And I remember, I was at Channel 7 in those days. To myself, I'm saying, wow, it's so cold so early. And we had, several inches of snow on the ground. And when you build a snow cover that early and it's so cold, think about it. The nights are very long. The days are short. The sun angle is low. It's hard to melt that snow, all right? So it really looked like all the ingredients were there for a long, tough New England winter. Lo and behold, the next month, January 1990, turns out to be the warmest January on record. A complete flip-flop in the weather pattern. And so that's just an example of how difficult it truly is before the seasons to actually make a forecast for how the season is going to average out when you can have such a dramatic shift in patterns within the particular season. Now, we're going to be talking today about climate, and this is the important thing to keep in your mind, the difference between weather and climate. Of course, there's a relationship. So weather is what we experience. We go outside, it's sunny, it's raining, whatever it may be, that's our weather. And when we think of a weather forecast, we're thinking of hours ahead, days ahead, maybe up to about a week. But when you get into longer time frames, like 30 days or multiple months or a year or more, and we talk about climate, we're talking about the average of the weather over a longer period of time. So that's what climate is. That's the difference between weather and climate. So if you're hearing a forecast that our climate is warming, it does not mean that every single winter will be warmer than average. It means going forward, on average, winters are going to get warmer. But you may have one winter that's way above average. Then you can have a winter that's slightly below average. So anytime it snows or gets cold, it doesn't mean, oh, see, climate change, it's like nonsense. All right, it's not like that. And remember, we're only one spot, one location on the globe. So we're talking about the climate on average around the world, for the most part, is what climate change is all about. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to now shift over here. So we're going to talk about climate and climate change and see where we can wind up with this after a little period of time. All right, so the idea, by the way, there's an organization, it's called Climate Central. And they're the ones that, they're very good. They have a lot of great meteorologists. They're down near the nation's capital. And they are providing a lot of information and a lot of graphics for television stations and things like that about climate change. So they're full-time working on it. And they've been very helpful in educating the public about climate change as well. So that's where some of these graphics are coming from. So basically the concept is the 3 S's. That climate change itself is fairly simple to explain what's going on. It is, of course, somewhat serious and potentially even more serious going out in time. And it is technically solvable. Now, I might take a little bit of an issue with the solvable, okay? To me, there's a big difference between maybe mitigating something, which means you do something to alter what was going to happen to some extent, but maybe can't prevent it completely, all right? Now, okay, some of you who know me know that I love tennis, and I love to play tennis. I'm still playing tennis, thankfully, and I'll play as long as I can. So for the most part, I've been very fortunate that I could still play tennis at this age, but I have some lower back issues. So does half the population that's over 40 years old. So that in itself is no great, revelation or anything like that. And it's basically a genetic problem. Some of you may have heard it, spinal stenosis. It's a narrowing down there and causes some pain and discomfort and things like that. So I cannot simply eliminate it. But I go through some stretching routines and strengthening routines. And if I'm very good about it and do it for a significant period of time on a regular basis, I can mitigate the problem. I can't eliminate it, but I can make it less of a problem for me so that I can still, for example, go out on a tennis court and other things and still be active. So that's where I think we really are, excuse me, in the idea of solvable, all right? We can mitigate it. We can slow down the rate of warming if we do certain things. And when I say we, I'm not only talking about you and me, I'm talking about our country, but of course you also need the cooperation of countries around the world. So it does get to be an issue. And I'm talking about the science of climate change. When we talk about policy, that's a little bit different, okay? Sometimes politics gets in there, okay, to say the least. And so I'm trying to stick mostly to the science, although we will get into some of those areas as we go through this. So let's get started and talk about how the idea of climate change is pretty simple. All right, so basically, in the simplest form, the burning of coal, oil, natural gas, all of that puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which means it tends to trap the heat. So as you're going to see in the future graphics, on an average day like today, sun comes up, it starts to warm, get to the middle of the day, early afternoon, you reach your warmest point, sun goes down, temperatures cool, okay? So we're getting incoming solar radiation, and then it escapes back out to space at night. But if you have a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, some of that heat that escapes back out isn't going to make it. It's going to get trapped and stay in the lower part of the atmosphere. And in fact, we have seen, when we talk about a warmer climate, we're seeing more of a change at night than during the day. We're seeing it both, day and night. But the nights are warming at a more rapid rate than the days. So keep that in mind as we go along. Now, this is very interesting because our atmosphere is made up of 99% nitrogen and oxygen. And the greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, are really a very small percentage. But even that small percentage can make a difference. Water vapor is also very important. We're going to be talking more about that, okay? Water vapor, which is moisture that we can't see in the atmosphere. It's in the gaseous state. Of course, when clouds form out of that moisture and eventually rain, then we see it. Then it's in its different form. So there's methane, there's nitrous oxide, but for the most part, we're going to be talking about carbon dioxide. So the greenhouse effect isn't really that complex. We've really already talked about it. There comes the sun, reaches the earth during the day. Now, at night, some of that energy is reflected back into space. Actually, some of it is reflected in all directions, as it turns out. So some of it is absorbed, re-radiated as heat. So we get to the nighttime especially, and some of it is going to go back out to space. Some of it's going to go in all directions. But the important part is the part that's going back out to space, some of that's getting trapped. Excuse me. And that's where the problem comes in. So we burn fossil fuels, puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's by burning coal, oil, and natural gas. And by doing so, which we are technically doing, humans are warming the planet. And we call that anthropogenic warming, human-induced warming. So this is a look at carbon dioxide. And you're seeing that this chart starts at 1880, goes all the way up to almost the current time. And you'll see that carbon dioxide is increasing. But notice the rate of increase has increased in recent decades. And of course, you know, we could talk about the Industrial Revolution and things like that. And you know, there was a point, I don't know what the numbers are now, but until not too long ago, the United States was 4% of the world's population, but using 25% of the natural resources. So that means, relatively speaking, we're a pretty spoiled country compared to some other parts of the world. But it's the rate of increase that has really caught everybody's eye. So, okay, so carbon dioxide is increasing, but is temperature really increasing also? Well, let's take a look. So you look at that and you go, yeah, that does seem to be increasing, but I see lots of ups and downs in there, okay? All right, well, remember, we're talking about climate. So what's important is the average of all those ups and downs in the temperature curve. But let's remember, we must never forget, and this is extremely important, that weather is driven by what we call the general circulation of the atmosphere. Let's put climate change aside for a moment, all right? Here's the story. Because of the way the Earth revolves around the sun, our planet gets heated differentially. Different parts of the planet are getting different amounts of energy from the sun, depending on sun angle, length of day, all that. So what that means is that in physics, simple concept, if you have a difference in temperature, you're going to have a difference in pressure. You're going to have a difference in wind speed, and things like that. And this is what goes on in the atmosphere. We get storms and things like that because the atmosphere is trying to achieve a balance, which it could never really do because of the differential heating of the planet. But that's what starts the whole thing into motion. That's what creates weather and weather systems and so on. And we get all sorts of weather. We know that over the course of time. That's, as an aside, I want to let you know that every kind of weather has, does, and will again pass through our area. And I truly mean every kind of weather. For example, if we talk about some of the greatest weather storms that we've ever experienced, the worst natural disaster was 84 years ago, the hurricane of 1938. And that was probably estimated to be a Category 3 hurricane, which is a major hurricane. So you're hearing, well, you can't get hurricanes that strong up here because the ocean waters are cooler, which is true, than they are down south. But a lot of times those storms can get caught up in a jet stream and be driven up here extremely quickly. In 1938, that storm went from off the North Carolina coast onto Long Island and then the south coast of New England in 6 to 8 hours. It was moving at over 60 miles an hour, caught in a very rapid jet stream and a rapid flow. Now, meteorology, far from perfect, has come a long way. Back then, it actually hit as a surprise to many people. And so what resulted was a storm surge on the south coast, and in southern Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts, between 500 and 600 lives were lost with that storm surge. People had no idea what had hit them. But here's what I want you to realize. We have a great weather resource in this area, the Blue Hill Weather Observatory in Milton, Massachusetts. It's 600 feet up. It has the longest continuous weather record of any reporting station in the United States. That's very important for climate change, because as you look at the change in weather, it is changed over the same location. Many other places, even in Boston, the measurements are taken at Logan Airport, but many decades ago, it was Scully Square, before there was even a Faneuil Hall, and so on. So that's a difference. That's a little bit of a different climate. So you're looking at the average of weather over, 150 years, but the weather station itself changed locations along the way. That affects the climate record. But at Blue Hill, you don't have that problem. It's a true, consistent record of the same location over a long period of time, right now, about 150 years. But in any event, during the hurricane of 1938, Blue Hill Observatory had a wind gust to 186 miles per hour. Okay? Now, elevation makes the wind even stronger. But even at low levels, you're definitely talking about over 100 mile per hour wind gusts from a hurricane up here. When you hear of something like that, it's not an accident. It means the conditions that can create a storm and take it along that path with that type of intensity can and has happened in the atmosphere. Now, it may not happen with the frequency here that it would in some other locations, but it can happen, which means it will happen again. And whenever it is, and nobody can say, people are not going to know what hit them. They're going to think a couple of things. Number one, I didn't think we could ever get a storm that bad up here. Number two, this obviously has to be caused by climate change. That may not necessarily be true because you can't explain 1938 by climate change. So you cannot blame everything on climate change. And to me, to have true credibility about the topic, you have to always keep it in proper context and perspective. We have a weather machine as it is, the general circulation of the atmosphere. It's always been there. It probably always will. You have to think of climate change as almost like superimposed upon the general circulation of the atmosphere. So what's happening with our weather is caused by the general circulation of the atmosphere plus some complicating effects of climate change. But when sometimes political people just blanketly blame every single event on climate change, they're really hurting the cause that they're trying to stress, okay? Because that allows still some naysayers to then say, that's ridiculous, you can't blame every storm on climate change. And that is true, you cannot do that. But it's almost like in some cases, climate change is helping to put some of the storms, let's say, on steroids. That might be a way to look at it, where certain storms might be a little bit stronger than they otherwise would have been. So why is that so important? Let's just take the fact that, think of our coastal communities, all right? We know that sea level is rising, in part due to melting glaciers and things like that. So if sea level is rising, and we get a nor'easter or a coastal storm, just like we've had in the past, that produced some coastal flooding and beach erosion, it may be able to produce a little bit more severe coastal flooding and beach erosion because you're starting with the sea level being higher to begin with. Now, if you then, because of warmer ocean waters and more energy available to the storm may be a little bit more intense than it otherwise would have been. That's another complicating effect which could enhance the coastal flooding and the beach erosion. Then if we look at the number of people living on the coastline or near the coastline compared to many decades ago, that's way up, as well as the structures, the number of structures, way up. So if you add all of that, there's obviously some reason to be concerned. So let's move along with this. This is just giving you one example, Oklahoma City, and you see that their average temperature is going up by a couple of degrees in, let's say, the last 40 to 50 years. And you might say, gee, that's not so terrible. I mean, if it's a little warmer in the winter, what's so bad about that? But of course, it also means in the summer, we may get more pronounced heat waves, maybe a little bit more severe, maybe longer lasting. Heat waves are tough. There are many, many, many people who do not have air conditioning, especially in urban areas where the heat of the day does not go back out to space at night because all that blacktop and concrete, all of that absorbs heat and doesn't really let loose of it. So a lot of times on a clear, calm, and still night, it could be 20 degrees colder here in Framingham than it is in downtown Boston, all right? Because here we lose the heat of the day, even though not as much as we used to because of the greenhouse gases, but a lot of that heat is trapped in the urban areas and the inner cities. So that's one example of the warming. So the idea, this is also showing you another example of Philadelphia, where their average temperature had a very, very slight cooling, maybe in the 60s or 70s. And for the most part, especially the last 4 decades, it's going up. Now, some people will say, well, if you go back in time, weather has always changed. Our climate has always been changing. True. There are things like sunspot cycles, and just the Earth's orbit and tilt and things like that may alter ever so slightly and can alter the climate. And this has all been looked at carefully. But still, we're not able to explain away the apparent human-induced warming. So, remember when I mentioned solving versus mitigating? All right, so this is kind of showing you that the current path we're on is a pretty bad one. That would be the pinkish or orange, red, whatever that color is. That would show you how much warming we're going to get going forward. We're just going to keep getting warmer and warmer. Now, if we cut emissions down significantly, then the rate of warming will slow. Okay, notice there's still a net warming, all right? And then a lot of people will say, well, all these changes, they may cost jobs, although they also create some. It may be very expensive. There's so many problems we have that money could be used for. If we can't even eliminate the warming, why bother? Or some people will say, well, even if we do all the right things in the United States, what about the rest of the world? What about countries like China and India? If they do nothing, then how much can we really diminish the warming? So these are all, certainly significant and worthy discussions. Of course, there are also those countries, individuals that could be leaders that set the tone, and maybe others follow. So there's many different ways to look at it, but mostly I just want to make us aware of the issue. All right, so it's not that complicated, but it is pretty serious. We've already talked about some of those things already, okay? We get more carbon dioxide with the burning of fossil fuels, temperatures go up, rising sea levels, more extremes in weather. Extremes in weather, never a good thing. Always going to be expensive in terms of dollars, and sometimes even more importantly, can result in loss of lives. So here's something that is just a given. A warmer world is a wetter world by definition, because warm air is capable of holding more moisture than cold air, all right? So that means we have the potential to get more frequent, or at least the events we get are going to be the high-end events of storms, and precipitation can produce even more. That may mean more flooding, freshwater flooding from heavy rains. Even this past summer, which was kind of a drought for the most part, there was one storm that gave about 1 inch of rain to Boston and about 11 to 12 inches of rain around Cranston and Providence, Rhode Island. That's like a quarter of the year's rain in like a 24 to 48 hour period, but it was very localized. So it didn't really do much for the drought in much of the area, but in a local area, it made a big difference. And that's something that's always a tough concept. That's one thing I'm glad that I'm not doing anymore for this reason. Always a tough concept, especially in the warmer time of the year, when you talk about thunderstorms or the risk of thunderstorms, okay? What does that do for you? If you hear, if it's even put in percentage terms, a 30% chance that there'll be a late day or evening thunderstorm. What do you do if, let's say, you have a child who's graduating college and you want to have a get-together in your backyard, and you're inviting people over, and there's a 30% chance of thunderstorms? What do you do? Do you go, well, the odds are still in our favor that there won't be, so we'll roll the dice. Some people will do that. Other people will say, no, not worth it. Not a thunderstorm, not worth the risk. But yet, even in this day and age, 24 hours ahead of time, I or anybody else could never tell you with certainty whether you're going to get a thunderstorm during that time period in your location. Why is that? Because you may have a situation where you have strong thunderstorms coming from the Berkshires. They're still strong all the way to Worcester. And then if you have certain wind directions, like off the ocean, they tend to diminish the storms as they travel farther east, and it's going to start weakening in Framingham and be done. Doesn't even rain in Wellesley. Well, what if the weakening happens a little more quickly? Then it won't even rain in Framingham. So those things are really not determinable to that specificity that you need in order to do your plan. So I always found it frustrating, because I knew I couldn't really give the specific information I'd like to give so people can, make the solid decision. But all you could do is just present the situation. So I used so many times, I would use terms like, when there were thunderstorms in the forecast, but most of the day will be rain-free in most areas, to at least let people know this is not an all-day thing, even if you do get it. But of course, you can get a damaging thunderstorm. And so the 15 or 20 minutes is extremely impactful. So those are things, but again, now we're talking about weather when I'm talking about that. Mostly here, we're talking about climate. So that's it. We're talking about more extremes in weather, more wild weather. But here's the thing. Not only higher percentage of high precipitation events, but also more frequent droughts. And you're going, wait a minute, that's an extreme on the other end. How's that happening if it's a warmer world? Well, a warmer world means the heat coming from the sun can also dry out the ground, take the moisture out of the ground faster. And in parts of the country or the world that are experiencing the drier part of the general circulation of the atmosphere, it may get even drier. Therefore, you hear a lot, you see a lot. The western United States, the drought, the fires, all the acres burning, and things like that. So at the same time, you have parts of the world getting more heavy precipitation events and storms being a little bit worse, And at the same time, on the other end, the droughts are a little bit worse. So you're getting the extremes on both ends, and that's tough. That costs dollars and may cost lives in some cases. All right, small changes can really be big changes in actuality. So relatively small shift of just a couple of degrees does make a big change. So what happens is, notice the amount of cold in the blue decreases as we average warmer weather. And the amount of warm weather increases. It doesn't mean there's never any cold air again. So that's the thing I want you to be aware of. It doesn't mean, even in a warmer climate, that we're never going to have a winter below average in temperature. Okay? But it's going to be less frequent. That's going to become more the exception than the rule. That's the idea. If you remember back, where are we now? Almost 8 years ago. Was it 14, 15, or 15, 16? I'm forgetting myself. 7 or 8 years ago, we had that winter where from late January to mid-February, we had 4 unbelievable snowstorms. And Boston, the city of Boston, right by the ocean, okay, but a very cold pattern, they had 80 inches of snow in 4 storms in 2.5 weeks, and all cold weather, no warm-ups. All right, there were some roof collapses and all sorts of things. One of the most intense winter periods we've ever had. So the idea is not that we're never going to have snowstorms anymore in the near term or anything like that. But what is becoming less pronounced, although I don't have research on this, this is just what I think I'm observing, is that it's getting harder and less frequent to get what we would call a long, continuous New England winter. I remember a few decades ago, I would go on the air and talk about a January thaw, which we didn't know exactly why, but a lot of times would happen around the 3rd week of January, which is implying there's no thawing before that, and there's no thawing after that. Forget about that. That doesn't work at all anymore. That hasn't been talked about in a long time. 2 years ago, if you remember Christmas time, 2 years ago, we had tropical rains, strong winds, and 60-degree temperatures, okay, on Christmas Day, all right? Yet I remember in the late 1970s, July 4th, where Arthur Fiedler, who was conducting the Boston Pops, there was a summertime nor'easter, and it was 57 degrees, rainy, breezy, and cool. So that means we now have an example here where July 4th was cooler than Christmas Day. Think about that for a second. That just shows you the extremes we are capable of here anyway, because where we're located is right near the battle zone. Cold air to the north, warm air to the south, moisture source, the Atlantic Ocean. So a lot of the ingredients are there, and that's why it's unusual for us to go into a prolonged drought. Now, even the drought that we've kind of been experiencing, some of that is due, of course, to not getting enough rain. Other parts of that have to do with how much are we requiring the usage of water. Has that gone up? And what about when pipes get old and they break and crack and things like that, and now the whole use of water becomes inefficient? So it isn't just caused by the weather. That's the principal cause. But there are other things. If we are requiring using more water, then even if we just get the average rainfall that we've always gotten, maybe it's not going to be enough. But to show you that this drought wasn't quite what some droughts have been in the past, any town or community using water from the Quabbin Reservoir had no problem. It never went lower than like 92% capacity. But it's using different sources for water where you can run into the problem. You know, people have wells and things like that. They run dry, they run dry. But the towns and communities using the Quabbin didn't really ever have a problem. So anyway, you know, sometimes things come into my brain and I know I go off a little bit, but it's always the idea where I'm trying to also show you the links and yet the differences between weather and climate, because we're really talking about both. All right, so this is interesting. This is showing you in the darker colors new record low temperatures for a date. And in the orange color, those are record high temperatures. So what I want you to notice is there were a couple of decades in the 60s and 70s where we actually had more record low temperatures than record high temperatures. But if we look at the most recent decades, you see what seems to be happening, okay? We're getting more record high temperatures and not as many record low temperatures. Not none, not as many. So you're still going to hear occasionally, oh, here comes a bitter cold Arctic outbreak, and record low temperatures are occurring, okay? Plus the fact, and I'm not going to talk about the source, I'm not talking about weather forecasts per se, but the way weather is portrayed as news sometimes makes you think the worst is happening every day. Because what they're showing you is where the worst weather is every day. Okay, I'm talking more like the national news when it shows you weather and so on. But here's something. We now detect tornadoes better than ever. Okay, people go out, believe it or not, sometimes it's not safe. You know that. There are chasers, and people are getting video, and then that gets into the news organizations, and you can see it. Decades ago, you didn't see on TV every tornado that ever occurred. So you may think there's more tornadoes than ever. The actuality is that tornadoes are down. The number of tornadoes around the country are down in recent years, and that may be a result of climate change. Because part of what helps cause that, if you have these storms and big temperature differences, let's say from the US-Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, that directly relates to differences in wind direction and speed as you go up in the atmosphere, what we call wind shear. And that's very, very needed ingredient for tornadoes. But the temperatures are warming on average, more so in the higher latitudes, like up in the Arctic region. But what that means is the temperature change on average from, let's say, the US-Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico is not as extreme as it used to be. So that means less of a temperature change means directly related to somewhat less wind shear. Less wind shear would actually mean less tornadoes. So climate change may actually lead to a somewhat of a decrease in the number of tornadoes in the United States. But yet at the same time, because we're overheating the atmosphere, the lower part with the heating, that starts the process that could create thunderstorms. So we actually can be getting a larger number of thunderstorms and a smaller number of tornadoes. All of these things are still and continuing to be ongoing research and evolving. And the other thing you want to see, so you say, well, why in the 60s and 70s was there a little bit of a cooling or more cold temperature records than warm? Because we still have that general circulation of the atmosphere and the jet stream that's always there and always causing weather differences. Remember, we're putting climate change on top of that, not instead of that. That's what needs to always be remembered. All right, so we're seeing some snowfall patterns that are changing in different regions. Globally, overall, less snow and shorter snow seasons. In some local situations, we're one of them, by the way, potential for bigger snow events in snowy areas, which is us. And actually, when we talk about the average snowfall in Boston, it's for over a 30-year period. And every 10 years, we jump it, okay, to the next, so that, for example, if we were talking about 1990 or 1980 to 2010 or something like that, once we get to 2020, now the most recent 30 years becomes 1990 to 2020. So we're talking about the most recent 30 years. And actually, the snowfall average in Boston has gone up, all right, because we've had some blockbuster storms. The warming that's occurring in the higher latitudes, more pronounced than what's going on in the mid-latitudes where we are, is altering to some extent the jet stream pattern. And interestingly enough, is allowing some storms to pass south of our area, which puts us on the colder side of them, a little bit more frequently. So even though we don't seem to be having longer winters or colder winters, we can get intense winter snowstorms and things like that within a portion of a given winter. That's what seems to be happening. So don't ever say, if you're halfway through winter, it's nothing winter, means the next half will be nothing. Not necessarily. But it's getting less frequent to see long, continuous winters, but we can have big weather events or an active winter weather pattern for a period of time within a given winter. That's what seems to be happening. Okay, this is just an example Bear Glacier, this is this is many glaciers, okay? Over time, what's happening? Glaciers are melting, all right, in a lot of cases. And the other thing is, we've talked all about this warming, and we've talked about the nights more so than the days, and yet 93% of the extra heat is actually going into the oceans. So what does that mean? Well, it means warmer ocean waters won't necessarily develop more hurricanes, but when a tropical storm or hurricane does develop, the warmer ocean waters can allow them to become a little bit stronger than they otherwise would have become. So that could be one of the factors, not the only factor, with Ian that did such a number, as we know, terrible tragedy around Fort Myers in Florida, okay? So that storm was probably a little bit stronger. I'm not saying the storm wouldn't have been there anyway and wouldn't have been strong, but it probably was a little bit stronger than it otherwise would have been, because those ocean water temperatures, as that storm approached Florida, were all 85 to 90 degrees. And usually 80 degrees or above is needed to sustain or even increase the intensity of a tropical storm or a hurricane. So that's why I say climate change is something like, kind of like putting some of these storms a little bit on steroids. That's kind of a way to look at it. And with wind, when you increase the wind, you're not just increasing the damage a little bit. It's not necessarily a linear relationship, it's more of an exponential relationship. So taking a category up in a hurricane just increases the damage dramatically. And then, of course, we talk about the cone. You know, when forecasts of a tropical storm or hurricane, don't focus on the single point, focus on the cone. The effects of the storm are not only found close to the track, you still get very significant effects even farther out. In general, because of the way air circulates counterclockwise around a low pressure area, it's along and to the right, or along and to the east of where that storm makes landfall, that you're going to get the very worst conditions and the strongest storm surge. Okay, so with this storm, although overall forecast quite well, but I'd say up to maybe in the 3 to 2 days before time period, it really looked like Tampa might be the place that was going to get hit the worst. Because if that storm passes just above Tampa, then the whole Gulf of Mexico is going to inundate Tampa and Clearwater, which is just totally flat and right at sea level, you know, and it would have been terrible. But taking that storm about maybe 75 miles farther south, which became evident in the 48 to 24 hours before, then targeted the very worst conditions a little bit farther south on the coast. The problem is that enough time to do all the evacuations that you need when you get a change like that? So you have to imagine some of the people in the Fort Myers area were saying, well, it looks like we're going to get hit fairly hard, but it looks like the worst is going to be up around Tampa and that area. And then when it starts to be realized it's going to be farther south, was everybody paying careful enough attention? Was there enough time to evacuate? And then, of course, in the end, that becomes personal decisions. There are some people that will never, ever evacuate, no matter what you tell them, for all sorts of reasons. Could be their personality, could be religious beliefs. I'm leaving it in God's hands. Forget weather, forget the science, I'm leaving it in God's hands. So, you know, that's just what goes on. That's the reality of, you know, people have different beliefs and different feelings about things, and that all gets into the mix. But anyway, this is a really dramatic graphic because, and a concerning one, because sea level rise is one of the most significant and dramatic changes that we've seen in recent times. Instead of going up a little or down a little or up a little or down a little, it is spiked up. And a lot of that is the warming of the ocean waters, the melting of the ice caps and the glaciers. So it stands to reason that if you're talking about coastal flooding and beach erosion, that higher tides are going to cause more flooding. Sea levels are rising slowly, and then the storms themselves, and if they're a little stronger than they otherwise would be, you add up the two, and this is what you get. All right? The trend is clearly up. This is just a graphic for Charleston, South Carolina. I don't think we need to focus on that. But just wanted to let you know, I made the statement that a warmer world is a wetter world by nature. 1 degree increase equals a 4% increase in water vapor. So that's why I say a warmer world is going to be a wetter world. Water vapor, the gaseous form of moisture, eventually will translate to clouds and precipitation. And this is proof that we are in a part of the country where we've seen some of the biggest increases in heavy precipitation events. I mean, when I forecasted many decades ago, I mean, if you got an inch of precipitation, an inch of rain, which on average would be 10 inches of snow if it was a winter storm, that's a significant storm, you know, one of the bigger ones of the season. Now we get multiple inch precipitation events like it's nothing, like it's routine. Again, it may not be the entire forecast area getting that. Sometimes it's somewhat localized. But we're seeing a 55% increase in heavy precipitation events here. And this is just showing you in Houston, where their average wettest day in a given year back around 1950 would have been 3 inches of rain. Now, the average biggest rainfall in a day or 24 hours is 6 inches. All right? It's doubled. Now, this is not factoring in Hurricane Harvey, because that just gave an insane amount of rain to Houston. By the way, as a little aside, when Hurricane Harvey, terrible storm, hit Houston and then just hung around there and just gave them an insane amount of rain, I happened to be on vacation. And some people actually wrote in and said, why is Harvey not working? Is he afraid to come into work because the association of his name with that storm? But other people wrote in and said, why isn't Harvey there? Is the station not letting him work because they're afraid viewers are going to have a negative association? Of course, neither one was true. I just was, you know, it was in the middle of the summer and I happened to be on vacation. Anyway, so we know that warmer ocean waters will give more fuel to the storms, and not necessarily to develop them, but once they are starting to develop, they can become more enhanced, certainly produce more rain, and if they become more intense, you're going to have more wind and a higher storm surge. Oops. Okay. All right, so there's hotter years also leading to higher fire risks, okay? And that makes sense. You're drying out the ground. It gets parched. And sometimes what they get out west is they get electrical storms. They may get thunder and lightning without ever getting the rain. So they don't get the moisture, but the lightning can spark the parched ground, and you know it's all wooded areas and starts the fires, and then the winds are strong, and then it's very hard to contain. So serious, to summarize, because of rising seas, more heavy precipitation events, and that obviously affects us, but affects us in other ways we haven't even talked about. For example, in health, all right? Warmer climate. For some people, this is good news. People who like to garden. On average, the growing season's a little longer. We're getting our first frosts in the fall, on average, a little bit later. And the last frost or freeze in the spring, a little earlier. Again, may not work every single year. This is on average. That's what climate is. And so, you know, that's good. However, for some farmers and some areas, the change in the climate might make very good farmland too dry now. So you have problems that way to make a living and also for food production. So there's all sorts of different effects. People who suffer from allergies in the warmer weather season. Well, it's great that the growing season's longer, but now allergy season is longer. So there's something that affects people in different ways. So again, just to show you the extreme weather from left to right on the top, the heavy precipitation, heavy rain, bigger snowstorms, the flooding that can result on the lower left, the parched ground, and eventually fires, and of course, hurricanes that may not be more numerous, but the strong ones may be a little bit stronger than they otherwise would have been. A little too fast. Okay. And then, of course, there's all sorts of effects on the animal kingdom, and they may have to be moving northward to climates. I mean, we're seeing more sharks here, because they're going to tend to follow what they feed on, wherever it's located. So we're seeing these changes, and of course, in some cases, it could lead to, extinction and things like that. Overall, a global decline in coral reefs, although I did see something recently in one part of the world where it may be getting a little bit replenished. So if we get more frequent or longer-lasting heat waves, when we get that, the wind usually comes from the southwest. That means our air is coming from New York, New Jersey. That pollution gets driven up to us, so our air quality can suffer more often, and that's a problem, certainly for people with respiratory problems. More heat-related illnesses. Could be that something like tropical-borne diseases like malaria may sneak up into slightly farther northern climates, maybe sneak into the south coast of the Gulf Coast or Florida or things like that. And increasing risk of insect and foodborne diseases, the longer allergy seasons we talked about. And food and farming, the stress, this affects livestock, shifts planting zones, and all sorts of things. And affects our way of life, like with sports. Okay, now, thank goodness for snow-making abilities now at ski resorts. But even so, since we get these warmer incursions within the winter more frequently, even up north, that's the worst thing that can happen. Okay, so it melts some of the snow. There'll be more. But then when these warm events end, it turns colder abruptly. And then everything is ice. The worst kind of skiing conditions you can have. So some people who have the ways and means, they say, we're going out to Colorado or Utah because, that's much better snow to ski on. It's powder, and they don't get this, these crazy warmings and things like that. And it can affect, other things as well. And this is just to show you that just by increasing the amount of warming by less than 1 degree Fahrenheit, you create, more of a sea level rise, more loss of coral reefs, for example, and people in urban areas especially can be affected by the heat, and if you have droughts, they're going to be affected, and you may get to like, sea ice or lack of it during the warm months to a greater degree. All right, so very briefly, we're going to talk about this, just briefly, solvable, or as I say, mitigating the problem, So what can be done? Well, obviously we need to do something because the rate of warming is obviously significant. And this is not an encouraging fact, but carbon dioxide is a gas that once it's up there, it stays there for a while. It's not gone immediately. So there's a lag and a, an effect. Again, we cut emissions, we cut the rate of warming. That's the idea here. And this is just showing you the different sectors of life that produces the increase in greenhouse gases. We've talked about some of the obvious ones, but it's in all ways of life. So here's a couple of ways. We talk about the sun, we talk about the wind, talking about clean, renewable sources of energy. Yes, it's true that the sunniest part of a country, on average, is in the southwest, but we have a good deal of sun here too. Now that I'm retired, I can occasionally get together with retirees from Channel 7, my old station, and Channel 5, my most recent station. So recently getting together with a group of Channel 7, some of the engineers, one of them was telling me he lives on Cape Cod, he's gone to solar, and it's working great. 1 month, he got paid money because I guess you put the energy into a bank and how that works. Somebody else told me they've gone to what's called a heat pump, and they're very happy with that. So there are things that are coming on, and of course wind energy. You see the strongest winds are actually out toward the Plain States, but we have significant wind here a fair amount of the time, so that can certainly work. That's just talking about California. I don't want to focus on that. And of course, electric vehicles. At Channel 5, there's a project called Forecasting Our Future, which is about climate change. And I did get to do one story back in the spring before I retired. It was about up in Beverly, where they're using electric buses to transport the kids to and from school buses. So I grew up in the Bronx, okay, in New York. And so I had to take buses a lot to get places. And sometimes I'd get to the bus stop, the bus just left. I mean, it's just leaving. It's frustrating. But what was more frustrating than missing the bus was that thick black exhaust smoke blasting into my face. Well, when I was up in Beverly riding on this electric bus, lo and behold, there isn't even an exhaust pipe. This is terrific. I mean, it's clean. You don't have all of that. Of course, it's expensive naturally, and it's newer technology. But so obviously, that's something that's happening. And that, of course, can be affected in different modes of transportation. All right, and then, of course, buildings. I'm not a structural engineer. It's not my area of expertise. But there's things like dynamic glass and insulation and electric heating and cooling. So there are things that are going on. New construction, the codes have gotten tougher. That's both to try to address climate change to some extent, as well as strong wind events to have less damage. You notice sometimes, of course, that storm was so powerful, Ian, down in Florida, some things were just wiped out. But a lot of times you'll see, one construction's demolished and one next to it is okay. Wow, that's probably due to the difference in construction, okay? So new construction, for example, the seaport's gotten really built up, and the seaport's right by the water. So what they've done is in the newer buildings, they don't put the furnaces down in the basement. They put them higher up so that if they do experience some flooding, at least they don't lose that. So there are things like that. For existing buildings, there's something called retrofitting, where you can do some things in some buildings to help fortify them. But of course, the easiest thing is with the newer constructions that are starting from scratch to have stronger and better building codes. All right, this is as far as I want to go right now because I wanted to leave a little time for some questions and comments. So if you do have anything's fair game. I just want to put before we do that, one little quick plug for the weather department at Channel 5. First of all, it's a terrific station. And I was really, really fortunate to be there the last 20 years of my career. Of course, I told you about Dick. But it's just great. I mean, I've worked with so many great anchor teams. Most recently, it was Maria Stefanos and Ed Harding. And, you're working. It's obviously the news is serious. But yet, we managed to have a good time because Channel 5 allows their on-air people to be who they are. And so when those opportunities exist within a newscast for a little chat or something like that, it's really great when you get a situation where all of you really like and enjoy and trust each other, and then nothing off color, but you can say anything to each other and nobody's going to get offended. So that was really nice. And Ben Simino is another unbelievably talented guy that has a great future. I hope he stays in the area at Channel 5. But there are a lot of really wonderful people there. In the weather department, so Cindy Fitzgibbon is now the chief meteorologist. Cindy's on in the mornings and noontime. I'm sure a lot of you see her. She lives in Natick, as I do. Cindy is unbelievable. I'm so happy for her. She is just what you see on the air. She's a wonderful person, a hard worker, terrific meteorologist, very active, and just terrific. It's been a great boom for Mike Wonkum. Mike, who's been with us for quite a while, been in Boston a long time. So he still had the weekend responsibility because I was there. So finally, with me not being there, now he slides into the Monday through Friday, early and late evening. So it's been a great thing for him. Kellyanne Chickalese, our weekend morning anchor, just had her second child. So she's now on maternity leave for several months. AJ Burnett, I call him our MVP in two ways, either and or, most valuable player, most versatile player. AJ does every part of the work in the weather department. He's the one who's always on top and creating all our computer graphics and in touch with our computer graphics company. He's also in touch with all of our web people, so everything that's online, WCVB.com, that's weather-related, goes through AJ, and the social media aspect of things. He's often out in the storms, during the storms, but he can also be in the studio. He does pull on air shifts as well. So he does it all. And the newest meteorologist, I actually haven't met him. We've exchanged emails. David Williams is the newest one. And so far, most of your comments have been very positive. Our weather team and station all like him. He seems like a great guy. He is new to New England, but don't hold that against him. I was once new to New England, too. And I'm from the Bronx originally. He's from Queens. So he worked in, I think, Amarillo, Texas, and Virginia. So he's getting used to living in New England and getting used to the weather patterns. But I think he has a good future, too. So I just wanted to put all that in. And now any questions or comments? Yes?
I have a comment and a question. I love my comment is
Okay, let me just let everybody know. The comment was loving Ed Harding and Maria Stefanos, especially together. They are a hoot. I 100% agree. Okay.
Work so well together.
They do.
My question is that from everything you said, it sounds like predicting the weather is difficult. So why do weathermen always try to predict a whole week out?
Okay.
It seems like a stretch.
Yes.
A lot of times it changes.
Okay. The question is weather predicting does seem difficult. So why do we try to predict all the way out to, a week ahead of time? I would say, in addition to your question, think of what we're doing, right? We know how complex the weather can be here. And remember, the geographical area we are forecasting for goes from southern New Hampshire almost out to Worcester, beyond Worcester, almost to Springfield to the west, North Shore, South Shore, Metro West, Worcester County, southern New Hampshire, southeastern Massachusetts, South Coast, Cape Cod. And so all we can do on that 7-day forecast is one number and one icon. Think about that. And think about how different many days, not all days, the weather is in different regions within the area we're forecasting for. So that's a difficult task right off the bat. But I will say this. We have come a long way. And at least in general terms, I do think the forecasts are pretty good, even out to 7 days. The thing is, what we're hoping is, if I or somebody else, let's say Cindy's on Monday morning, and she's forecasting all the way through to the next Monday, all right? Maybe you never see another weather forecast in the next 6 or 7 days, and maybe she had forecast that a week from that day, meaning Monday, was going to be sunny, and it winds up raining, and you go, don't know what they're talking about. Now, we have to assume you're going to come back again at some point. You can't just hold us to the thing 7 days from now. What we're saying is, this is what we think as of now. This is the best we can tell. And it's just like something that maybe is far away and is blurry to you, but as you get closer to it, it starts to come into focus. That's true with big storms. However, sometimes, instead of it getting simpler, it gets more complicated. For example, might be able to tell you that in about 6 or 7 days, there's really potential for a big storm, okay, maybe a big snowstorm. And 6 days, 5 days, 4 days, I still feel the same way. Now, 3 days, I can start to see some of the details, and I realize, uh-oh, we're going to have rain-snow line issues now, all right? And so in other words, as a forecaster, as you get closer to it, you're able to see some of the complexities that you could not have seen 7 days out. So in some ways, even though it's supposed to get better and better, it gets more complicated because it's going to be a complicated storm. That's just the realities of the different patterns. Obviously, this pattern is easier to forecast that we're in right now, okay? But this is the exception more than the rule, especially as we go into the time of the year that we're now approaching. But no, that's true. It's only extended out. Our computer modeling goes out farther. It's more reliable than it used to be because we're getting better information into those computer models to begin with. In other words, the initialization, the observations around the world. Planet's 70% ocean. Until we had weather satellites up there to remotely be able to measure like ocean water temperature, that was like, a black hole. So we don't know 70% of the data. How good could a computer model be if it's missing 70% of the data it needs to start doing the math and physics? So it has gotten better, and the idea, though, is assuming that you're not going to just see once for 7 days down the road and never check again. Then it wouldn't be really that reliable. But as giving you an idea, and then, for example, maybe there's a potential for a storm, but as you get closer to it, the storm wound up being a day later. You're not going to know that 7 days out. So maybe all I can do is I can see there's a pattern change coming. I can see the potential for storminess is up. So stay tuned, and we'll, as we get closer to it. That's the best way to handle that. Yes?
One thing is puzzling to me. This past summer, in the summer about 5 or 6 years ago, we
Yes.
had droughts.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the summer, about 3 or 4 years ago, in the summer, not this summer, but the summer before, we had a lot of rain to the point that I even told my friends, oh, we're having a rainy season, and it even caused floods on Route 9. How do you explain that you have a pattern that lasts a few months, whether it's a dry causing a drought or very wet with heavy rains?
Right. Yeah, the question is, how can you explain the fact that, even over the last 10 years, we've had a few summers that have produced drought-like conditions, but we've also had one or two that there's been a very rainy pattern, But again, that's weather. And that's climate also, because remember, we talk about our average weather over a long period of time, but within the averages, you can have a lot of swings. I used to say sometimes, I might have been on the air and I'm showing, gee, the high for today, look at this, was 60 degrees and the low was 40. That's exactly normal for this time of the year. And then I'd say, which is pretty abnormal for us. Why am I saying that? Because the averages that we have, because we're a changeable climate, often consist of extremes on one side, extremes on the other, which get you to the average, but that's not what you usually have. You're usually on that side or that side, but it averages out in here. So, so that's some of what's contained within that. We're capable of very different patterns. That's why I say, even with climate change, yes, we're getting warmer and we're getting wetter. It doesn't mean that every single year will be warmer than average or every single year will be wetter than average. But on average, more of them will fall into that category in the future than has been the case. That's the way you have to look at that. I know this gentleman. Herb.
Harvey, follow us through the storm of 76, 7 days out.
You mean 78?
78. Follow us from the beginning, 7 days before, and how you determine.
Okay.
It's gonna be a big storm.
All right, the question is to take you through the blizzard of 78 from the days before, like a week out, and what happened. Okay, do any of you have a few weeks to spend with me here? That's a very hard, long story to turn into a short story. But the blizzard of 78 was my first winter in Boston. I did forecast for 3 winters in Providence, Rhode Island, on Channel 12 there before coming to Boston. But it was my first winter in Boston. But to best answer that for me, and by the way, I know that, I've gotten a lot of credit for that. And by the way, it certainly didn't specifically say this will be the worst storm we've ever had ever, or that this is going to be the most snowfall ever. But I was talking in terms of a very major snowstorm, 3-4 days out, and one of the biggest of the season, which was a big statement because 2.5 weeks before the blizzard of 78, we had a 21-inch snowstorm in Boston in just 12 hours, okay? But the best I can tell you to answer that question, for me, and by the way, a lot of people, people were so nice when I was retiring, a lot of nice emails from people. I think 50% of them reference the blizzard of 78. Like, I've watched you ever since the blizzard of 78. I saw you forecast the blizzard of 78. Okay, I'm just saying that not as many people saw me forecasting the blizzard of 78 in real time as they think. Why do I say that? Because I was on Channel 7 in those days. And in those days, Channel 4 and Channel 5 were way more popular than Channel 7. They had far more viewers. So I know the number of viewers that actually watched it live is not as great as the response I get. However, because of having all the video clips of me forecasting the storm, every time we get to the 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, 15-year anniversary, 20-year anniversary, there comes the clips, which of course become more comical for the difference in the way I look compared to it. But that's another story. But it's right there. And so a lot of people have seen that often enough to really feel they saw it in real time. And yet, some did, but not as many as think. But anyway, I have to talk about when I studied meteorology in New York, City College of New York, got my bachelor's degree. I then wanted to work, and I could not get a job. I tried with the National Weather Service, with the private weather service. Couldn't get a job, so I went on to graduate school in meteorology at NYU. And there was a professor there. His name was Vinnie Cardone, and he would be the person that I would call my mentor. The reason I'm saying that is he was a brilliant guy, but he was very human and very approachable. When I say brilliant, I mean he was a PhD, but it's like he has a PhD in meteorology, oceanography, mathematics, and physics, but yet very human, very approachable. And I went up to him one day and I said, Vinny, I've noticed all the courses, there's no real weather forecasting course, which is amazing to me, which we would call synoptic meteorology. I said, you'd be great if you were teaching that. So he said, well, you know what? If you start a petition and get enough signatures, I'll be happy to teach the class. So that's what I did. I went around to some of my classmates in graduate school in meteorology, got 9 signatures. That was enough for him to teach the course. I learned more in that class than any other single class I took. And some of the things I learned, which this is going back now to the early 70s, 50 years ago, about the idea that the jet stream and what's happening high above us and the wind flow up at 20, 30, 40,000 feet, that actually will cause what happens at ground level to happen. Why is that important? Because in the days of the blizzard of 78, through no fault of their own, they're great, they're pioneers, all right? They set the stage for people like Bruce Schwegler, Dick Albert, myself. I'm talking about Don Kent, Bob Copeland, all right? When they went to school, this wasn't known. So because of Vinnie Cardone in this class that he taught, I came to realize that you don't need to already see the storm on the weather map to know it's going to develop. If you have enough energy, disturbance strong enough in the upper atmosphere that's going to dive toward the East Coast, that storm will develop. But the meteorologists in those days, the more mature ones, they had to see that storm on the weather map before they would really start to feel it could happen. So that's why my forecast was somewhat unique in those days. And a lot of it's due to Vinnie Cardone, Dr. Vinnie Cardone. By the way, I've had a lot of weather interns through the years that are studying meteorology, and then they come in and they help me out, and they learn a lot, but they also give a lot to me because they're sharing what they're learning in school as I get older. So that helps, okay? So it's a two-way street. By the way, if any of you ever see or have ever seen the weather in the mornings or whatever, I think on NBC 10, Matt Noyes. Any of you ever see Matt Noyes? Matt Noyes, terrific meteorologist. He was an intern of mine for 2 summers when he was going to Cornell. And there's a lot of them. There's somebody who's from Canton, Mass. originally. His name is Lee Goldberg. He's now chief meteorologist, WABC TV in New York, doing great. He also went to Cornell and was an intern of mine for 2 summers. So it really gives me a very good feeling to know a lot of those are now all around the country doing a great job as meteorologists, on the air. But getting back to the blizzard of 78, so I was all, days ahead of time. I was exhausted by the time the storm hit because I was so intense leading up to it. And 4 days before, 3 days before, I even remember some of the language I used, like 3 days before. I caught myself getting like a little too excited on the air, and I remember saying, one must be careful, however, because if one goes too far out on a limb, one could fall off. I remember saying that. But anyway, I worked the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before that storm. And I wasn't the chief meteorologist. Dr. Fred Ward was. But he also was a physicist and worked for the government at Hanscom Field in Bedford. And he had to be out of town for a couple of days. So I got to work the Thursday, Friday before the storm, as well as the Saturday. I didn't work the Sunday. The storm started on Monday around noontime. But Sunday night at 11:30, I left home to go to work, even though I didn't have to be on the air till like 6 in the morning. And my wife Lorraine says, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "You have to ask that question?" But she was 6 months pregnant. And she said, "All right, when are you coming home?" I said, "I have no idea. It may be a while." It was a week. So that's what happened. But I was just so lasered and focused in on that. And there are all sorts of stories related to it. And I don't mean to belittle anyone because, Dr. Fred Ward, he's a great guy, and he's still alive and well, thank God. I think he's 93, PhD. And, but he just really didn't, he would forecast somewhat on statistics, like how likely is it to have a storm that bad. So he wasn't thinking it was going to be that bad. Well, anyway, the day the storm hit, we both had worked, and then he was ready to go home. He lived in Weston. I said, "Are you out of your mind?" And he goes, this is, even though my name is Harvey, there's no R in my name here in New England. So he would go, "Hey, Have." He said, "I'm going home." I said, "Fred, are you out of your mind?" It's insane. How can you do that? He says, I've seen it all, no problem. So we left to go home. 2 hours later, police escort brings him back into the building. Poor guy, felt really bad for him. But no, that's just an aside. There's so many, human stories aside from, unfortunately, also tragic stories, of course, with the, the backup on 128 and a coastal destruction. That's probably the most unique thing about that storm. Here it was a winter storm, and you'd think a hurricane came through places like Hull and Situate and Winthrop and Revere. And I remember doing a live shot a few days after the storm in Hull. We did a special. There was a reporter, Mike Levitt at the time, and I were down at Hull, and the seawall was just chunks of concrete, broken up, far removed from the seawall. So you realize the power. There really isn't many forces in nature stronger than rushing water, ocean water, with tremendous force. And obviously, when it does that to seawalls, that speaks for itself. So that's a long answer to, I know what was supposed to be a simple question. Anyway, sure, yes.
I was wondering, how much does the polar shift affect the weather?
How much is the what?
Polar shift, the Chandler's wobble, the north.
Oh, okay. The Earth's orbit you're talking about, yes. How much does the Earth's orbit shift the weather? That's a very good question, and there are a lot of people that also believe cycles can be attributed to that. And that's true. That's why it's not 100%. I think the latest was 97% of climate scientists are convinced that climate change is real and it's a big concern going forward. There aren't that many naysayers anymore, but some of them would talk about the things like the Earth's orbit and things like solar flares, gaseous eruptions on the sun, which seem to go these maximum minimum cycles, which can have impacts on weather and the circulation. So that's why I try to stress that the general circulation of the atmosphere is still the main driving force of weather and climate and always will be. It's the human-induced climate change is superimposed on top of that, not instead of that, okay? So that's the way to look at it. But yes, there are all sorts of other things. There are many oscillations that we know about. For example, a lot of people may think that in the last 25, 30 years, there have been a lot of tropical storms and hurricanes due to climate change. We actually are in a multi-decadal cycle of active tropical storms and hurricanes in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. So the latest research is not that there will necessarily be more storms, more tropical storms and hurricanes due to climate change. It's that there may be some that are even more severe. That's the real thought on that. Yes.
I was going to touch on hurricanes. I grew up in Dominica. In the
Yes.
Caribbean.
Growing up in Dominica, yes.
I grew up in hurricanes, and we used to actually go outside and play in hurricanes. Now my mom is telling me you can't do that anymore, and I heard it's like the suffering polar the same. And what's causing all this intensity? Because hurricanes are like much more devastating in the Caribbean. Right?
Yes, good question. From Dominica, yes. So tropical storms and hurricanes are part of, what you're obviously very attuned to and know that. But what we always have to remember is even with a hurricane, even a very powerful hurricane, and sometimes you see on TV and they talk about, oh, look at the size of that on the satellite. It's 480 miles across, okay? That doesn't mean that all craziness is going on over 480 miles. The reality of it is, even a very intense hurricane force winds may only extend out about 45 miles from the center. So even if you have a hurricane that has highest winds of 150 miles per hour, you have to be in the comparatively small geographical area that is experiencing that. If you're not quite in that area, yes, you'll still be impacted and affected, but not to the disastrous levels that those really in that eye wall. We call it an eye wall. So there's an eye, and that usually a well-developed hurricane, the eye is calm, but the first concentric ring around it is where all heck is breaking loose. That's where the winds are the strongest, and the rain is the heaviest. So even though it's a very intense hurricane, if you don't get into the eye wall, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. So what you may be recalling may be storms where you did not get into the eye wall and people still, still functioned, or, well, this wasn't that bad. But again, if you get into the eye wall of a powerful hurricane, as Ian shows you, that's it. So, and look at Tampa. Tampa was almost unaffected. But the reason is because of that shift in track, they wound up on the other side of the storm. So the Gulf of Mexico didn't inundate them because the storm passed below them. If the storm had passed over or just north of them, they would have experienced what Fort Myers did. And they are way more populated, and that would have just been a catastrophe. So, there's certainly legitimate concern. And then the fine-tuning, see, that's the difference. I mean, Tampa did have some power outages, some flooding, minor wind damage, okay? But that would be maybe something that maybe you experienced as a kid because that's where you were relation to the storm. You weren't in that eye wall. That's the real thing. Yeah, no, that's okay, yes.
You talked about forecasting our future at
Yes.
Channel 5. Do you guys talk about more than just weather, like
Yeah.
impact to the population? Like, for instance, I live in a place right now where we have wells, and the entire association is dry,
Right,
and we don't know what to do. And
Right.
we're looking for answers to that.
okay,
Do you talk about solar? Do you talk about
right.
what can we do?
What can you do?
to help?
Okay, the question is about the Forecasting Our Future, which is the title that at Channel 5 we have to the idea of not just climate change, but how it's affecting in different ways and what can or is being done about it, what innovative things are coming up. So you were talking about the fact that you rely on well water and things are just too dry. What do you do? That is obviously a problem. That's why I'd mentioned for people or towns that use the Quabbin, they have no problem. So some people have no problem, other people, are desperate. It's tough. It's really tough if that's the only source, of water. That's one of the risks of something like that, when you're relying on well water, because then, unless you get help in certain ways.
Yeah, I've seen a ton of houses like going deeper.
Right, but yes, that could be, you're going deeper to try to get to water, yeah. And then yet we can run into other periods of time that are so wet that the water table rises so high that, now you're getting flooding just because the water table has gotten too high. That's why I say extremes are the worst. They cause the biggest problems, But, yeah.
Are there places to go to, look into things like that?
Well, that's a good, what I'll do is I'll bring that up, the idea of people and communities relying on well water. What can they do? What are their alternatives when you run into really dry periods? That's a great question and a great concern. So again, that's why we talk about averages, but what good is it if the average is really made up of that extreme and that extreme? It would be great if the average weather was really the weather that occurred most of the time. But this is the problem, more extremes in a climate change world.
Right, and we have, lights all over the place, and I've been saying, let's put those little, solar pads on top, so we're not paying for.
Yeah, there's a lot that's going on. That's the one good thing, is there's a lot of innovation, going on in a lot of areas, and and there's a lot of smart people. So, hopefully, we'll hear of more solutions, and Channel 5 will be able to report on them. Yes, you had a question. I want to get over to this side.
Just a couple of comments.
Yes. I'm going to shift here.
Channel 5 has been my station of choice for the better part of the last 50 years. And I remember watching Dickie for many years, and then when you came along. And I always appreciated how your enthusiasm, for one, that came through, both of you, and your passion for your subject, but also that you were not alarmists.
You're welcome.
Even predicting big storms, you did it for real. And as you said, with thunderstorms, you might get it here, you might not get it there,
Right.
and so forth. You were never alarmist. There was a part-time forecaster, I'm not sure whether it was Channel 5 or not, who was an alarmist, and every storm was gonna be the worst storm. Predicted way more rain, snow, or whatever.
Yeah.
You guys always made it real.
Yeah.
The other comment I have, totally different subject, is that another part of the area that Channel 5 and all of the Boston stations really cover and don't give much attention to is the eastern part of Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that they realize how many people in the quiet corner,
Yeah.
east of Hartford, watch the Boston stations.
Yeah, those are very good comments for those of you that didn't hear. I don't know if we have our feed going on or not, but first of all, very nice comments. Thank you that were directed toward Dick and myself, and the idea that we would do our best to inform everybody without being alarmist. Yes, that's true, and I think the dedicated, and real meteorologists, of course, are always going to be aware of that. Our errors are just genuine errors. They're not errors because we're trying to make something into something it isn't, or the other way around. We're doing the very best to communicate to the best of our ability what we see, what we think is going to happen, and adjust as we go along. So I appreciate that. That's a very good comment about eastern and especially northeastern Connecticut. I don't know these days. A lot of people are on cable. A lot of people are not on cable now, where it goes. But with cable TV, things have changed a lot. For example, when I worked in Providence, Rhode Island in the 1970s, I could see Boston television. This was before cable, Now you can't do that if you're in Providence because they're protecting their affiliates down there. So, it's a little bit different. So I don't know. The comments we would get most often would be people who were maybe around Ludlow or Palmer or that area, and they would say, excuse me, I have some information for you. Massachusetts does go west beyond Worcester. It would be nice if you thought about us. A lot of comments from very nice folks in the Berkshires who are very frustrated and want to see us, do more time for the Berkshires. Now, what happens is, if there's a day where there are thunderstorms moving into the Berkshires that'll probably never even get to Boston, I'm going to focus, when I was working, a lot on that, okay? But if we have active weather everywhere within our viewing area, obviously the first responsibility is to our, viewing area, which of course is the greater Boston metropolitan area. It includes, Metro West and Worcester County and Southern New Hampshire, Cape Cod, everything, all that. And you have to do that. Because as much as it's flattering and appreciated, and we'll try to service them as best we can, the Berkshires are really not in the Boston television market. They're really serviced by the Hartford, Springfield, and Albany markets. So they actually have two markets outside of Boston that are actually there to service them. But some will say, yeah, but I like Boston stations better. It's more professional or whatever, and so on. So of course, I'd always answer, respectfully and honestly, and do the best we can. A good comment that's made, and it's a justified criticism, I can't see the weather in my community. I find myself doing this. You're always standing right in front of where I live. And it's driving me crazy. So, but those are justified criticisms because of the way we're presenting weather. We're in front of this green screen, and, there could be different ways to present it where you have a large monitor and you're next to it. Now you won't be blocking anything. Why not do that? Well, what happens is the person then becomes pretty small who's forecast, who's on the air. So that's up to, TV stations, how they want to, present.
I got a big laugh. It's relatively recently, within the last few years, when all of a sudden Willimantic started appearing on the map.
Well, there's a reason. That's another thing, very common. How come, I can't believe you always talk about or show the weather in Orange, Massachusetts, And it's like, no offense, but, there aren't that many people that live in Orange, Massachusetts. Why is that? No, we're not playing favorites. I mean, certain things we've done, remember, there's many more newscasts and many more weather appearances within the newscast than there used to be. So we've had to set up things that are more automated in our computer graphics. Well, there are certain stations that are National Weather Service official reporting stations that report each and every hour. So they're Boston, they're Bedford, Norwood, Used to be South Weymouth, no longer. New Bedford, then a bunch on the Cape, Worcester, Lawrence, Orange, Mass, Willimantic, Connecticut. So that's the reason, that you're seeing more from that. And what we have to hope is that hopefully you live somewhere near one of those places so that that's. But of course, if we get into, like heavy storms that are very localized with radar, we'll zoom in to the communities and give you an idea of what time that storm may be reaching you, as it moves at a certain speed. And there are more tornado warnings than there used to be. Not necessarily more tornadoes. Why do I say that? Now we have Doppler radar. Doppler radar gets in and also measures the wind direction and speed within those rain clouds. So we are able to see, for example, if we're in a certain spot and the winds are very strong on one side of that location in one direction and very strong in the opposite direction, that's a circulation, and that could be a sign of a tornado if the rotation is significant enough. However, when a radar beam goes out from the site, we have radar in Taunton, for example, it gains height as it goes out in distance. So even though there's a rotation, it may be several thousand feet up. Will that ever come down to the ground? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But now for safety, there will often be a tornado warning based on the rotation seen on the Doppler radar. So what that means is there will be some false alarms. But even if it's a false alarm and no tornado happens, you can be sure at least a severe thunderstorm is going on. So it's still a very significant weather. And sometimes severe thunderstorms and microbursts can cause as much damage as a tornado can. So it's still serious. Yes?
So if I understood you right at the beginning of your talk, you said something about the snow cover in Siberia?
Yes.
October will determine our...
Well, it's a factor.
What does that tell us about this year?
That's a good question, and hopefully I'll begin to know the answer to that early next week when I hope to speak to Dr. Judah Cohen, and then we hope to get that report on the air either later next week or the week after. And again, that's one of the factors, but it's something that does seem to have relevance. So it's helped, I think, in getting into the mix of trying to do something that's very difficult immediately. The question was about the snow cover in Siberia in October and what it could mean for our winter.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do have to wrap it up. I know we could ask Harvey questions for hours. But thank you all for coming. Thank you online. Thank you in person. There are evaluation forms in the back. And please, let's thank Harvey for sharing his time and his talent.
By the way, it's not an official college class for me, so if you give me a low grade, I'll be able to handle it. So don't worry about it. No, thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate the opportunity. Oh, hi, how are you? Good to see you. Nice to see you, too. Yeah, oh my gosh, it's been a while. Oh my gosh, how are you?